Hi, this is Miss Nikki. Welcome to Chapter 4. These are the four major tissue types that we're going to talk about: epithelial, connective, nervous, and muscular. A little bit of background on tissue. We have about 50 trillion cells, but we only have about 200 different types of cells, and we saw those different types of cells in Chapter 1 or 2 or 3, I can't remember. Histology is the study of tissues and how they form organs. We'll talk a little bit about if you wanted to look at a particular type of tissue, you'd put it on a microscope slide and you would look at the microscopic anatomy. That's histology. Tissues are comprised of two subcategories, if you will. Tissue has cells, and it also has extracellular matrix. So the cells are those 200 different types of cells, and the extracellular matrix is the stuff that gets pushed outside of the cell. So extracellular matrix, we talked about exocytosis. If I have a cell and it's going to make a product, a protein, and excrete it outside of the cell, we can use that to anchor two cells together, and if we anchor two cells together, we now have tissue. Basically, tissues are groups of cells similar in structure and function that are going to have some sort of very specific structural or physiological role. And these are those four majors. I have little bullet points here for you. We're going to go into more detail, but basically what's the nervous system? That's used for internal communication. Muscle tissue is used to contract or move something. Epithelial tissue is going to protect. And then connective tissue is going to join or support other types of tissue together. So if we wanted to look at tissue underneath a microscope, we have to do a couple of things. One, we have to fix the slides. So we have to preserve with some sort of solvent the tissue. Remember, tissue is living. It will deteriorate and break down, so we're going to fix it or preserve it. We're going to cut it into really thin slices, and then we're going to stain it to enhance the contrast. So usually when you look at slides under the microscope, or the slides that are going to show up in your book, they're going to have a pink tint or a purple tint. They were stained specifically so that you could see the tissue. So let's talk about the epithelial tissue as a whole group. We'll do the summary here. It forms boundaries between different environments. It regulates what comes in and goes out of the body, so the entrance and exit points. It has several functions, but the three we really need to focus on are protection, absorption, and secretion. So yes, it does these others, and especially sensory reception. We talked about this in Chapter 1 when we felt that it was cold outside. That's sensory reception. But we need to look at and focus on protection, absorption, and secretion. Where do we find epithelial tissue? In the skin and lining the hollow organs. So when I say hollow organs of the GI tract, I'm talking about gastrointestinal, stomach, small intestines, large intestines. There are some special characteristics of epithelial cells. So cells have polarity. Polarity means opposite, so they're going to have an upper end and they're going to have a basal lower end. So this would be basement end. If you want to think of it as basement, this is apex or top. They have microvilli, which are the little fingers, and have cilia, which are the hairs. They're comprised of closely packed cells. So remember, epithelial cells are close together, and they're supported by connective tissue. So directly underneath epithelial, you're going to have connective tissue. Epithelial is avascular. A means not. So they do not have their own blood supply. The connective tissue has to feed the epithelial tissue. Innervated means nerves. Do they have nerves? Yes, there is nervous tissue going into epithelial tissue. And they have a high rate of regeneration. If you cut your finger, skin cells will grow again. Classification of epithelial. We have simple and stratified. So simple is single layer, stratified is two or more. And then the second name, we say what it looks like. Is it flattened? Is it cube? Is it column-like? So here's an example of simple, which is one layer. Here's an example of stratified, which is two or more. Here's an example of the squamous or the flat. Here's the cube-shaped, and here's the columnar-shaped. So when you think of simple, you should automatically think of one layer. And then the next thought should be, this is going to have something to do with absorption or something to do with secretion. First example here is simple squamous epithelium. This is a single layer. It allows for the passage of materials by diffusion. Remember, diffusion is moving a non-charged molecule from high to low, like carbon dioxide or oxygen. Requires no energy, passive transport. Hopefully remember that. The location that I would like you to remember where you can find simple squamous epithelium is in the air sacs of the lungs. So this would make sense if this tissue is really good at transporting oxygen and carbon dioxide. It would make sense that you would find this in the air sacs of the lungs. This is where we breathe in oxygen and exhale carbon dioxide. The next type is simple cuboidal epithelium. It's a single layer, cube-like cells. They're important in absorption and secretion, and you find these in the kidney tubules. So they do both functions. Either you're going to secrete water and it's going to form urine, or the kidney tubules can reabsorb any electrolytes like sodium or calcium or potassium. They can put them back into your bloodstream. So simple cuboidal can do both secretion and absorption. And you can see them here. They're cube-shaped right here. Next type is simple columnar. These are single layers. They're very tall cells. Again, absorption and secretion. Best location to think of these is digestive tract. So here in your stomach, the cells are going to excrete hydrochloric acid. So we're going to have secretion, and that allows you to break down the food that you just consumed into smaller parts. But here in the small intestines, these cells are going to absorb, or you're going to have absorption of the nutrients from the food that you just ate. So different parts of the digestive tract are both going to have simple columnar epithelium, but one's going to be involved in secretion and one's going to be involved in absorption. Pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Pseudo means false or fake. So basically they look stratified, but they're not. If you follow this cell all the way down, it reaches the apical or apex and the basal or basement portion. So even though they look stratified, they're really layered. And then another dead giveaway are these little cilia, these little hairs. So these cilia, sometimes they'll call this ciliated, let me spell it right. They'll say pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. These cells secrete mucus, and they also have those cilia which can propel items up and out. And where do you find this? You find this in the trachea. So we're constantly breathing in pollutants in the air, right? And so you bind those pollutants with mucus, and then the cilia helps you sweep the mucus containing pathogens out. Stratified would be two or more. And anytime you see stratified, I would think something about protection. So stratified squamous epithelium, they're saying it's two or more layers. It's this squamous shape or flat shape, and we're still talking about one of the major tissue types, which is epithelium. So it's thick, several layers. The bottom or basement membrane is active in mitosis, meaning these cells copy and copy and copy. So one of the good examples of stratified squamous epithelium, one of them is your skin, because we know that the top layers of our skin flake off and that new skin takes its place. The tricky part about location is that we're going to have two types. We're going to have non-keratinized and we're going to have keratinized. Keratin is a lipid that offers waterproofing. This will make more sense when we get to chapter 5, but basically it's a lipid that forms in certain layers and it blocks off or waterproofs, so the top part is waterproof. Non-keratinized is another type of stratified squamous. Those cells do not produce keratin, and you find these in moist linings like the esophagus and the mouth and the vagina. So there's keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, and then there's non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. The next two here, stratified cuboidal and columnar, are quite rare, and we don't find them in very many areas within the body. That's what they mean by limited distribution. So take a look at this slide and just be familiar with these two. I don't have anything highlighted in red. For the last slide, when we talk about stratified anyway, this is transitional epithelium. And what's interesting is that it resembles both squamous and cuboidal cells. So you can see these are more cube-shaped, and then these get pulled apart a little bit more in the squamosal. What's great about this transitional epithelium is that it stretches. So the best place to locate transitional epithelium is in the bladder. This allows for the bladder to stretch as it fills with urine, and then once the urine is expelled, the bladder will contract back to its normal size. I want to mention granular epithelium before we move on. We're going to talk about glands in much more detail when we get to chapter 5, but I want you to realize that these are made from epithelial cells. So here's the definition of a gland: one or more cells that makes and secretes some sort of fluid, watery, aqueous, and we call that a secretion. So here's a figure from your book. You can see there are simple tubular structures. There's some that are branched. There's some that are compound branched. They have 2 or more extensions off of the branch. But what's going to happen in all of these cases, you can first see that they are simple cuboidal cells. They're going to secrete their product into the duct system, and then it's going to travel up to the surface. So when we talk about sweat glands or salivary glands or oil glands, we're going to call them sebaceous in chapter 5. If we're talking about stomach glands that secrete hydrochloric acid, these are all epithelial tube-like structures found in the body. This clinical homeostatic slide, I want to talk a little bit about cancer cells. So cancerous epithelial cells in particular are not contained by the basement membrane. So what they're saying is, here are the cells, the epithelial cells, and then remember there's the basement membrane, and then there's connective tissue underneath it. What they're saying is, if this cell decides to divide and divide and divide and keep dividing and form a tumor, that tumor can get into the connective tissue. It can penetrate the underlying tissues. And then what's special about connective tissue is that it has blood vessels. So then this tumor can get into your blood vessels and then spread throughout the entire body. Next major category is connective tissue. It is the most abundant type of tissue that we have in the body of the 4 major tissues, right? Epithelial, connective, muscular, and nervous. It is mostly vascular except for cartilage, and you have to make that distinction. You have to say that cartilage is avascular. Cartilage does not have its own blood supply, just like epithelial cells don't have their own blood supply. But all of the other connective tissue is vascular, meaning it has its own blood supply, going directly to that tissue. You'll see in connective tissue that there's more space. The cells are not packed close together. And there's more extracellular matrix, stuff outside of cells. There's a variety of functions here. Because connective tissue is such a big category, we're going to see many functions. So connect organs to each other. They give support and protection, store energy, allow for movement. So when we talk about connective tissue, we're saying blood, bones, fat cells, cartilage, tendons, ligaments. So here's a great picture of connective tissue from another source, but I wanted you to see. Obviously, let's go back just for a quick second and make sure we can name this epithelium. I was going to say obviously you know it, but let's make sure. So if this is one layer, this is simple, and their shape is cuboidal. So this is simple cuboidal epithelium. Everything underneath is going to be connective tissue, right? So there's 3 components of connective tissue. You're going to have cells, and you can see all the cells here. You're going to have fibers, and then ground substance is all the stuff that's in the background here. This is also a cell. Here's the picture broken down just a little bit more so we can see what's exactly in the ground substance. So we have interstitial fluid here, and basically this is the fluid that's secreted from cells. It's a watery fluid, and it fills in all of these spaces here. There's going to be proteins in that fluid as well, and water. Basically, this interstitial fluid is the fluid between cells. Is going to allow for nutrients to be taken up and for waste from the cell to be excreted. Fibers, we have collagen, elastic, and reticular. You can see the elastic fibers, this dark black, the collagen, this wavy. And then the reticular fibers are these little spider-looking fibers that actually help keep the shape of the connective tissue. And then we have cells. We have different types of cells. We'll learn more about these as we move our way through anatomy. Fat cells, plasma cells, mast cells, they all excrete a particular item. But then this one here, fibroblasts, this is the cell that makes the fibers. So fibroblasts are cells that make protein, and that protein is folded into specific shapes, and here we have our fibers: collagen fiber, elastic fibers, reticular fibers. Here's a chart showing you the classes of connective tissue. So we'll focus on these subclasses, and then we'll look at each of these independently. So they have a loose connective tissue subclass, and then they have a dense connective tissue subclass. Then we're going to talk about cartilage, and remember, cartilage is avascular. Then we have bone tissue, and we have blood. So here's the first connective tissue. This is loose connective tissue, and this is called areolar. And if you remember, we said wherever there's epithelium, directly underneath it is going to be connective tissue. Well, this is the connective tissue. So areolar connective tissue is widely distributed under the epithelia of the body. It's going to wrap and it's going to cushion organs, and it's kind of a gel-like matrix with all three fiber types. So you can't see the reticular, but they're in here. But you can see the elastic is labeled, the collagen is labeled, and you see where the spaces are located. So there's lots of spaces. In these spaces, you're going to have room for blood vessels. So blood vessels will be able to come up really close to the epithelium or epithelial tissue and supply blood to that tissue. So the next loose connective tissue type is called adipose. And here you have your adipocytes, or fat cells. So you can see the fat cells here. People say it looks like popcorn. This is going to provide a reserve of food, so you're going to store fat in these cells. And we can take fat and it can enter into the cellular respiration cycle, and we can make some ATP. So if you run out of glucose, that's when you start burning fat. It's also going to insulate and protect organs, and that's why you find it underneath the skin in the hypodermis. So basically a fat pad or fat tissue that has the ability to be an extra energy reserve, but also insulates body heat as well. The next type of loose connective tissue is reticular. Reticular we really see in the spleen, and reticular has lots of reticular fibers, so that should make sense as why it's called reticular. And again, we have lots of spaces, so we're going to have blood vessels. It's going to provide an internal skeleton for certain cell types. So again, we see this in the lymph system, which we won't talk about till 202. We see it in the spleen. But basically, these reticular fibers actually create a framework or scaffolding for white blood cells to sit on in your lymph system and wait for fluid to pass by and then attack any foreign pathogens that aren't supposed to be there. The first type of dense connective tissue that we're going to look at is called dense regular. It's called dense because you can see there's not a lot of spaces, and it's regular because the collagen fibers are in a regular pattern or a parallel pattern. The function is that this tissue is used to attach muscles to bones or to attach bones to bones. So come down here to ligaments and tendons. Remember, ligaments are bone-to-bone attachment, and tendons are muscle-to-bone attachment. So this ligament right here moves in one direction. It can pull out, and then it can push back in. So you're going to find these in tendons and ligaments. The pulling force is applied in one direction. The next type of dense connective tissue is dense irregular. And again, dense because there's not a lot of space between the collagen fibers. But irregular here, you can see how the collagen fibers are running in an irregular arrangement. This allows this tissue type to withstand tension in many directions. Best example is probably a joint or joint capsule. So this is a great picture here at your shoulder. Think about it. Your shoulder can move. You can move your arm out to the side. You can move your arm above you. You can cross your arm over your body. So you have several ranges of motion in your shoulder joint, and that's because of the dense irregular connective tissue. Also in your dermis, We'll talk about your skin. This is the lower layer of your skin, or what we call the integumentary system, which is next chapter. But this allows you to have a little bit of pull and flexibility with your skin. So you could pick the skin up on your arm, you could twist it, you could let go, and it would go back to its original location. The last dense connective tissue is called elastic. So this shouldn't be any surprise that there's more elastic fibers. This tissue is very important because it allows for the recoil following stretching. So one of the points we like to make is that elastic fibers, it's not the fact that you can stretch them out. It's the fact that when you stretch them out, they snap back to their original location. And a great example of this is in our large arteries, particularly our aorta. So your aorta has to fill with lots of blood, and then this blood goes out to your body. So this part of your blood vessel fills up, and then when the blood leaves, it goes back down. So we need to have elastic fibers there so that it can go to its original shape. Also think about areas where we have a lot of movement, where we have a lot of expanding and contracting. So the bronchial tubes, remember the bronchial tubes, right and left bronchus, and the bronchioles, those are in your lungs. And again, your lungs are going to have to inflate and deflate, right? Along with the vertebral column. So you're going to have a lot of movement as you're walking. You're going to have expansion, contraction there as well. And we'll talk more about some of the cartilage connective tissue in the vertebral column. On to cartilage connective tissue. Please remember that cartilage is avascular, so it receives its nutrients from the tissue that's surrounding it. We're going to talk about 3 different types: hyaline, elastic, and fibrocartilage. So here we have hyaline cartilage. We always call this Scooby-Doo eyes. If you don't know what Scooby-Doo is, sorry, I guess I'm old, but we call it Scooby-Doo eyes. These are chondrocytes, and hopefully in the first lab you talked about the word chondro, and that chondro meant cartilage. In the background here, there are collagen fibers. You just can't see them as readily as you could in the last couple examples. So chondrocytes are kind of mature cartilage, and chondroblasts are the immature. And we'll talk more about blast versus cytes when we move into bone. What is the function of hyaline cartilage? It's going to support and it's going to cushion. It's going to cover the ends of long bones. So anytime you have a bone and a bone, you're going to have some sort of cartilage, and that cartilage is going to be hyaline cartilage. So think about this example. If we're talking, this is costal cartilage of the ribs. Every time your lungs expand and contract or inflate and deflate, if you didn't have this cartilage here, you'd have bone-on-bone interaction, or you'd have bone pulling away from bone. So instead of having bone-on-bone, we're going to fill that gap with cartilage, specifically hyaline cartilage, and that allows for cushioning, and it uses the words compressive stress, resists compressive stress. The next type of cartilage is elastic, and you can see now we have many more elastic fibers. There's still collagen in there, but now you can see more elastic, and this gives shape and flexibility. The best example is your ear. So you're able to fold down the top portion of your ear and let go, and it'll flap back to its original location. Fibrocartilage, this is going to have thick collagen fibers. So it's like hyaline cartilage, it's just thicker. Some people think of these as shock absorbers. So probably when you look at the intervertebral discs, you'll think of that. It's kind of like those gel insoles that people put in. So they're going to absorb compressive shock. You find these in the vertebral discs and in the discs of the knee. On this clinical slide, we notice we're mentioning avascular cartilage. We're talking about 2 different things. One, injuries heal really slowly when we're talking about cartilage because it is avascular. So the fact that it's avascular means that we have to have diffusion to get the nutrients and the healing properties over to the cartilage tissue, so it's going to heal very slowly. This is common in people with sports injuries. It takes a while for cartilage to heal. But the other thing that happens is that cartilage loses its ability to divide as we age, and sometimes the cartilage can become calcified or ossified as we become older. In some cases, this is a normal process. In other cases, this ossification can happen in an area where you don't want it to occur, like say between your first or second ribs where the costal cartilage meets the sternum. That structure can turn bony instead of having flexibility, and that can cause some issues. Now we move into the other category, and for the other category we have bone, which is also osseous tissue. So what's going to happen are the osteocytes are going to secrete a matrix, and that matrix is going to become hard. When it becomes hard, it forms these rings. Some people say these look like tree rings. So the osteocytes are going to harden with calcium or become calcified, and that creates bone. These are well vascularized structures. At the very core where this central canal is located, you're going to have arteries, veins, and blood vessels. The function of bone, most of us know that it supports us, but it also protects. So any area that you have bone, so your sternum in front of your heart, your ribs around your lungs, your vertebrae around your spinal cord, and your cranial bones around your brain are all going to offer an added layer of protection. Also, your bones are going to act as levers for the muscles. So attached to your skeletal bones, you're going to have muscles, skeletal muscles, and when these contract or become smaller, they allow for the movement of the bone. So the bones act as levers for the muscles. The next category is blood. This is still connective tissue. Even though you don't see any fibers running through here, they are present. They're just not activated until we need some sort of clotting, until there's damage and we need to form a clot. But we do have red blood cells and white blood cells and something called plasma, which is a fluid. This is a white blood cell and this is a white blood cell. What does blood do for us? It's going to transport these respiratory gases when they talk about carbon dioxide and oxygen. It's also going to transport nutrients. We know this because we have glucose. Any sort of waste can be filtered through our kidneys or our liver. And then other substances, you might have some electrolytes, sodium, potassium, calcium. And where are you going to find blood? It's going to be contained within the blood vessels. So now the next major category, remember we're on this, the third major, because we did epithelial and connective. We're now on to muscle. And muscle has elongated cells that contract by some sort of stimulus. They're responding to a stimulus and they contract or get smaller. They're highly vascularized. Remember, muscle has to get glucose and oxygen because it wants to make ATP in order to do work. So what is the function of muscle? They're going to move something. They're going to exert physical force and move tissue. We have three different types. So skeletal muscle is attached to bone. It's going to move the bone. Cardiac muscle is the heart, and it's going to move blood. And then smooth muscle is around hollow organs. It could move food or it could move liquid. So when I say hollow organs, we should be thinking esophagus, stomach, intestines, also your blood vessels. Skeletal muscle is the first type of muscle we're going to talk about. These are long, cylindrical, multinucleated cells with striations, which are the lines. So these lines have something to do with proteins. When they say long and cylindrical, you can see that in this microscope image. But something we should talk about why they're multinucleated is that during mitosis, you have one cell and it copies itself, and now you have two. In a muscle cell, you have one and it undergoes mitosis, but it doesn't split. And then proteins start filling in. They're being made by the cells. And then that cell's going to copy itself, but it doesn't split again. So you end up with these really long cells, and they have many nuclei inside of them, and then they have lots of proteins, and that's what the lines represent. For function, you should understand voluntary movement. Voluntary movement means that your conscious mind initiated the movement. So your brain tells your muscle to contract, but because you initiated that response. Where do you find this? These are all, skeletal muscles are always attached to bones. Cardiac muscle is the second type of muscle we need to talk about. It's a little bit different because you have branching and you have these intercalated discs. So here and here, any of these dark, they have to do with gap junctions. If we remember, we talked about gap junctions and how they allow cells to communicate with each other and specialize, beating at the same time. They're also branched, but they still have lines. So remember, those lines correspond to proteins. For function, it's under involuntary control. Your brain is telling your heart to beat, but you don't have conscious control over it. You're not sitting here saying, okay, heart, beat now, beat again, beat, 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 beat. We'd be consumed with telling our heart what to do. So the brain takes over subconsciously where you don't have conscious control of our heart. And then where do you find cardiac muscle? We find it in the heart. Third type is smooth muscle. And smooth muscle forms these sheets, and they have spindle-shaped cells. They kind of look like squamous cells, right? The difference is smooth muscle is going to have a ringing motion. Some people think of it like wringing water out of a towel. So instead of having this pull and push like we have with the cardiac and the skeletal, in smooth muscle, it's more of a ringing. And this is because we're going to propel food and urine through a hollow tube. So we're talking moving food down from the esophagus into the stomach, into the small intestines, large intestines, also moving fluid like in your blood vessels, moving blood, or moving urine from your bladder into your urethra. And these are all involuntary control. You don't have conscious control over propelling food through your small intestines. It's happening subconsciously. Nervous tissue is our last category, and we only have one slide to look at. Let's look at the function. It allows for internal communication between cells. So basically, the brain initiates, the message travels down the spinal cord, and then out of the spinal cord to the nerves. So from the brain, down the spinal cord, and then coming out of your spinal cord, you have nerves. Here's the nervous tissue underneath the microscope, but first let's look at the cartoon version here. Here's the cell body. There are these appendages or branches. These are called dendrites. There's this long tail, which is called an axon. So you can see the cell body here, and you can see the axon. The rest isn't clearly visible on this microscope slide. So what do neurons do, or nervous tissue? They're going to transmit electrical signals. And where do we find them? Brain, spinal cord, and nerves. This is from another book. This is from a McGraw-Hill book, but I wanted to put together the different major tissue types, so that you could see how they all come together. So here's our epithelium, and you can see here this is the ciliated pseudostratified epithelium. Then you're going to have your basement layer, and then directly underneath it you're going to have areolar connective tissue. And this is a great picture because you can see how those blood vessels weave through that empty space in the areolar connective tissue. Then directly underneath it you're going to have a muscle layer. And then running through all of these layers is going to be nervous tissue. So nervous tissue innervates all the other tissues, but I wanted you to see how they kind of stack up here. We need to look at three different types of membranes. We need to look at the cutaneous membrane, which we call skin. We need to look at the mucosal membranes and the serous membranes. Basically, membranes are going to have two primary tissue types. You're always going to have some sort of epithelium, and you're always going to have some underlying connective tissue. First example is cutaneous membrane. Again, this is skin, or the integumentary. Integumentary system is when we also include accessory things like glands and hair and nails that we'll get to in the next chapter. So remember, skin is stratified squamous epithelium, in particular keratinized. Remember, this was that lipid waterproofing. This is our epidermis. So they're trying to show you anything here in the darker pink. That's all epidermis. And underneath is the dermis. So this is going to be made up of epithelium or epithelial cells, and this is going to be made up of connective tissue. Specifically, we'll talk about it, but if we remember, areolar. Next is mucous membranes, and mucous membranes line the cavities open to the exterior environment, and they produce mucus. So the respiratory tract is a great example. In all of the mucosal linings, so here in your nose and your throat, your trachea, into your lungs, this mucus is going to trap any particles. So when we're breathing things in, we're not always breathing in just oxygen, right? There's pollution, there's dust, and this mucus is going to trap those particles so that they don't get in here and clog up lungs. The last type of membrane we have is serous membrane, and we've already talked about these. Remember the serosa, these are going to produce serous fluid anywhere where we have heat and friction. We have parietal serosa and we have visceral. Go back and visit these and remember that parietal touched the cavity wall and that visceral actually touched the organ. And then this name depends on its location of the serosa. So this is the heart, these are the lungs, and this is the abdominal cavity or abdominal organs, right? Last topic to talk about is tissue repair. We're going to have two major ways in which tissue can be repaired. One is regeneration and the other is fibrosis. Regeneration is when the same kind of tissue replaces the damaged or destroyed tissue so that the original function is restored. Fibrosis is what we would call scar tissue. So when connective tissue replaces the destroyed tissue, but the function is lost. Basically saying, I'd rather just knit this tissue back together so I don't have a gaping hole rather than have the tissue function as it normally did. So basically, that's where we have scar tissue. In this slide, you can see inflammation. This is stage 1. Inflammation sets the stage. So when you have a cut or tissue that's damaged, you can see there's blood that has made its way into the damaged area. So we know we've gotten into the connective tissue, right? So connective tissue has the blood supply. Epidermis, which is epithelial cells or epithelium, does not have its own blood supply. So you know if you cut yourself and it bleeds, you've gotten into the connective tissue. But what's going to happen is these chemicals are going to be released from the tissue, and it's going to go into the bloodstream here, and it's going to cause white blood cells to come and try to clean up the infection. So remember, on the surface of our skin, we have bacteria, we might have fungi. So these white blood cells are going to come and try to clean up this gaping hole so that the pathogens can't get into your bloodstream. The second stage here is where we're going to have repair starting. So you can see that the fibroblasts are starting to create fibers that are going to knit back together this connective tissue. And you can see the regeneration of the epithelial cells where they're copying and they're filling in this area where the scab is located. For this last slide, we can look at the differences between regeneration and fibrosis. So here we have regenerated epithelium, but here in this section we have scar tissue or the fibrosed area in the connective tissue. So obviously different tissue types are going to regenerate differently. So you can see which ones generate extremely well. Bone, dense, irregular, areolar, and your epithelial tissues. With moderate regeneration, this is smooth muscles that line blood vessels and hollow organs, dense, regular, connective. And then they use the word virtually no functional regenerative capacity when they talk about cardiac and nervous tissue of the brain and spinal cord. The reason they say virtually is that we have seen some regeneration in these tissues, but it's not enough. If you damage either your heart or nervous tissue in your brain and spinal cord, it cannot regenerate enough to replace the damaged tissue, so you're going to lose function in those areas. For this clinical slide, I want to point out the importance of scar tissue that forms in organs. So remember, scar tissue is where you lose the functionality of that particular tissue. So in the heart, this could be a problem. So what happens if you have scar tissue in the heart? You could lose the volume capacity, so the heart's ability to hold blood. You could block substances from moving from one area to the other. In the heart, that would be a problem. And then you can also interfere with the ability of a muscle to contract, or in terms of the nerves, with nervous cell transmission to that muscle in order for it to contract. For the last slide, I want to look at the primary germ layers. So early in embryonic development, these three primary germ layers develop, and they give rise to a number of tissues. So ectoderm is going to be outer, meso is going to be middle, and endo is going to be inner. So the ectoderm is going to be the nerve. Remember, we have our brain and we have our spinal cord, and both of those are on the dorsal side. So they're actually on the outside. We have mesoderm middle, which is muscle and all the connective tissues. And the inner lining, remember, we have those inner epithelial linings. So the lining of the stomach, the intestines. You don't have to understand the 16-day-old embryo, but I would like you to see how the primary germ layers, these three types, turn into all of the tissue. And you can see here that epithelial tissue originates from all three germ layers. So be familiar with ecto, meso, and endoderm and what type of tissue would arise from each of those primary germ layers. That's it for Chapter 4. I'll see you next time.